visată, noutate restaurat. 1728 nodul, textul, povestea. Problema, moartea, secretul. Reciprocă, suprarealistă-i, Trezirea, visată. Pe Domnul. Adormit, mort, să-l ierte Dumnezeu că e bun. Vinul cel roșu e foarte bun. Să curgă, tare, tăria, stai, hai, să dăm vise. Are legătură, că știi, e clar. Pe partea cealaltă se zice, consumul excesiv de sens e depășit de realitate ai tăi.
Ești fiul tatălui tău, uită-te în ochii mei, ești sau nu ești? Întrebat polițistul, da, i-a răspuns psihoanalistul. El e fiul defunctului, Vinul a fost perfect, zise ea. Concluzia, Dumnezeu e al dracului.
Nu, oare tu ai citit?
Da, am citit.
Da, și popa a uitat cum se face slujba de mormântare de iertăciunii. Să-l ierte Dumnezeu a uitat, fiindcă pan are coarne.
Să-ți dea Iisus celui.
Completă groparul plecând, amețit geaca uitându-și. Să-l ierte Dumnezeu că prea bun a fost vinul. Cel roșu și coniacul. Hai că dracu.
Ești fiul tatălui tău, uită-te în ochii mei, ești sau nu ești? Întrebat polițistul, da, i-a răspuns psihoanalistul. El e fiul defunctului, Vinul a fost perfect, zise ea. Concluzia, Dumnezeu e al dracului.
Nu, oare tu ai citit?
Da, am citit.
Muza e ciorbă de legume, arde iute verde, la pachet, frigul amândită, străbunica-i ghicea în cafea, realistă-i, adormirea. Să vă fac cunoștința.
El e fiul defunctului.
Cafea minerală, eu piper. Este și felul 3, surplus, înghețată. Eu l-am cunoscut. Foarte bine ai zicea. Polițistul supremiat.
Tu ești fiul tatălui tău, nu cred, uită-te în ochii mei, ești sau nu ești? A întrebat polițistul.
Sunt.
I s-a răspuns, să-l ierte Dumnezeu. Să-l ierte!
All right, let's dive into something a bit different today. We've got these, well, imagine snippets of dialogue, like you're overhearing conversation at a funeral, hushed whispers, and we're going to use Lacanian psychoanalysis to unpack it all.
Oh, that's intriguing. Snippets, huh? Sounds like we're in for a challenge.
Exactly, a real deep dive. We're talking the symbolic, the imaginary, the real, even the idea of death itself, like a mirror reflecting our deepest anxieties.
I'm game if you are. It's fascinating how even fragments, just pieces of a conversation, can touch on those big Lacanian themes.
Okay, so before we get lost in the whispers, we need a little foundation, right? Let's start with the symbolic order. You know, that complex web of language, laws, social norms, everything that gives structure and meaning to our world.
The framework, right. The way we understand ourselves and our place in all of this. And funerals, they're steeped in symbolism, aren't they? The rituals, pronouncements of faith. It's like this human need to impose order on something as chaotic as death.
Makes sense. And then we have the imaginary, that early stage where we feel complete, fused with the mother figure. But as we grow, we enter the symbolic order, and that wholeness is disrupted.
Right. And that's where the father figure comes in, the name of the father, as Lacan puts it. It symbolizes the entry into the symbolic, accepting laws and limitations. The father, symbolically, separates us from that early unity and pushes us into language and social structures.
So think about this. What happens when that father figure, that symbol of authority, vanishes, like literally death? Does that throw our whole world into question?
Absolutely. And that's what's so compelling about these funeral dialogues, right? They capture that sense of disorientation, the struggle to reestablish a sense of self when that anchoring figure is gone.
And then, of course, there's the real. That which goes beyond language, beyond representation. The raw, unmediated experience we can't quite grasp.
Death itself, I'd say, is the ultimate encounter with the real. It disrupts the symbolic order, throws our carefully constructed reality into question, forces us to confront the limits of understanding.
All right, so we've got those three key concepts: symbolic, imaginary, real. Now let's get to the actual dialogue. There's one phrase that pops up again and again.
Ierte fiul tatălui tău. Are you your father's son? It's almost haunting, this constant questioning of lineage. What's going on there?
It's the heart of Lacanian identity formation. When the father dies, the son's place in the symbolic order becomes uncertain. That question, are you your father's son? It's not just about biology, it's about symbolic inheritance, his place in the world.
And it's not just the question itself, it's who's asking. A police officer adding another layer of authority to the mix.
Exactly. It highlights the societal pressure to conform, fit into a predetermined role. That officer's questioning, it almost has an accusatory tone, like the son's identity isn't his own. It's determined by lineage, by his connection to the deceased father.
So we have that external pressure to conform, and then the internal struggle to figure out who you are without that defining figure, like a psychological tug of war. And what about the others, those around him? How are they reacting to this death? We see a real mix of responses, which I think speaks to the different ways people cope with the real. Some seek comfort in ritualistic phrases like salerte Dumnezeu, may God forgive him, clinging to the symbolic order, religious beliefs, to make sense of the loss.
Trying to find stability, meaning in something larger than themselves, makes sense. But then there are others who seem to be coping in a completely different way. They're indulging in earthly pleasures, wine, cognac, almost like they're trying to numb the pain.
And that, to me, points to a regression to the imaginary. Seeking solace in sensory experience, a temporary escape from the harsh reality of death, avoiding the symbolic weight, the need to grapple with the profound questions it raises.
So some clinging to the symbolic, others retreating to the imaginary. But then there's this line that throws everything into chaos. Domnul dracului, God is of the devil. So jarring, almost blasphemous in this context. What do you make of it?
That's where it gets really interesting. That statement, it could be a complete breakdown of the symbolic order, the traditional authority of God, a cornerstone of that order, suddenly challenged.
Like their whole belief system is crumbling. The death of the father, that encounter with the real, has shaken their faith to its core.
Exactly. And it raises the question, what happens when the symbolic order, the system of meaning we rely on, fails to provide comfort, fails to provide answers?
Do we retreat further into the imaginary? Do we try to construct a whole new symbolic order? Or do we get stuck in this in-between space where everything feels uncertain, unstable?
That's what we're going to explore as we delve deeper. Because these fragments, they're not just an intellectual exercise in Lacanian theory. It's a glimpse into that very human, often messy process of grappling with loss, with the search for meaning.
I don't know about you, but I'm already feeling like I'm falling down a rabbit hole of fascinating and unsettling ideas. And we've only just scratched the surface.
And what's even more intriguing is that this is all playing out at a funeral, a setting already loaded with symbolic meaning. It's like the funeral itself becomes a stage where these psychological dramas unfold.
Yes. And speaking of the setting, there's another element we hasn't even touched on yet. The role of the psychoanalyst in all of this.
Yeah.
He's a curious figure, especially in this context. It's not every day you see a psychoanalyst at a funeral.
That's right. And his presence raises a whole new set of questions. Questions about authority, about the relationship between the conscious and the unconscious, the power of language to shape our understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
All right, so we've laid the groundwork, introduced the key players, started to unpack some of those initial layers of meaning, but there's so much more to explore.
Before we get to the psychoanalyst, I want to circle back to those characters seeking solace in, well, earthly comforts. There's this line, Musa itiorba del legume. The muse is vegetable soup. It's such a strange image, right? The lofty concept of the muse brought down to this simple, almost childlike thing.
It's a line that always makes me pause. What's happening there? Just finding comfort in the familiar.
I think it's deeper than that. Remember how we talked about regression to the imaginary, coping with the real? This line, to me, feels like a textbook example. The muse, representing inspiration, creativity, reduced to something basic, primal.
So it's not about the soup itself. It's a deeper psychological process, a retreat from the complexities of the symbolic back to a more fundamental level of experience.
Exactly. Facing death, these characters seek refuge not just in food, but in a kind of pre-symbolic state, where meaning is simpler, less burdened by language and social structures. And it's not just the muse becoming soup, right? There's that preoccupation with the wine, the cognac, fixated on sensory details, trying to ground themselves in something tangible.
You know, it makes me think about how we often turn to simple pleasures, almost ritualistic behaviors when we grieve. Cooking a favorite meal, listening to a particular song. There's that desire to connect with something familiar, something comforting on a very basic level.
Absolutely. And those seemingly mundane actions can be incredibly powerful. They tap into a deeper need for connection, a sense of continuity when everything feels disrupted.
Okay, so we've talked about the symbolic, the imaginary, the real, the ways people cope with death. But what about the psychoanalyst? Where does he fit in all of this?
His presence is intriguing, isn't it? Especially at a funeral where you'd expect a priest or religious figure to take center stage. But here we have this figure representing a different kind of authority, the authority of the unconscious.
It's like he's stepping into the void left by the decline of traditional religious authority.
Maybe. But remember, the psychoanalyst isn't there to give answers, to impose meaning. His role is to help the subject uncover their own unconscious desires, anxieties, help them make sense of their own internal world.
So in these dialogues, how do you see the psychoanalyst engaging with these fragmented conversations, these anxieties about death, about identity?
He's like an interpreter, right? Helping to decode that symbolic language of the unconscious that's surfacing. And what's interesting, he repeatedly affirms the son's identity. Elle est fille du dracului. He is the son of the deceased.
Almost like he's trying to anchor the son in reality, counter those destabilizing effects of the father's death.
There's definitely that element. But it's also about acknowledging the son's right to his own grief, his own process of working through this. The psychoanalyst isn't there to replace the father, but to help him navigate that complex terrain of his own psyche.
This whole idea of the funeral as a stage for psychological dramas is fascinating. And the psychoanalyst, in this context, becomes a kind of guide, helping us understand the deeper meaning behind the words, the actions.
And it's not just the characters in the dialogue, is it? We, as listeners, are invited to engage in that interpretation too, explore our own responses to these fragments, these glimpses into the human struggle with loss and making meaning.
It's like these snippets act as a kind of Rorschach test, prompting us to project our own experiences, our own anxieties onto the scene. And speaking of projection, one of the most striking images is death as a mirror.
That's powerful. Lacan talked about the mirror stage, right? That crucial moment where we recognize ourselves as separate individuals. But that recognition comes with alienation. We're forever split between our internal experience and the image we project to the world.
So where does death fit into this idea of the mirror?
Death, I think, is the ultimate mirror. It forces us to confront our own mortality, our fragility, the limitations of our self-constructed identities. It reflects back those fundamental questions we often avoid. Who are we? What's the meaning of all this? What happens after we die?
Like it strips away all the masks, the social roles, and leaves us face to face with the raw truth of our being.
And that can be terrifying, absolutely, but it can also be incredibly liberating because in that moment of confrontation, we have the chance to reevaluate, to shed what no longer serves us, and embrace a more authentic way of being.
This is making me rethink funerals entirely. It's not just about mourning the dead. It's about confronting our own mortality, our anxieties about identity, about meaning.
And it's about recognizing the power of the unconscious, the way it shapes our thoughts, our feelings, our actions, even in the face of something as profound as death.
Okay, so we've got death as a mirror, the psychoanalyst as interpreter, these characters grappling with loss. But there's one more layer. The idea of these funeral dialogues as a kind of dream work.
Yes, this is where Lacan's ideas about the unconscious in dreams become really illuminating. Dreams are a form of discourse, he believed, full of symbolic condensations, displacements, not just random images, a way for the unconscious to communicate.
So are you suggesting these funeral dialogues are like a collective dream, a shared unconscious space where they're working through these anxieties about death, identity?
Exactly. Think about the illogical leaps, the repetitions, the strange juxtapositions. It has that dreamlike quality. Meaning is fluid, elusive.
And the line, musa y thorba de legum, suddenly takes on a whole new meaning. It's not just seeking comfort, it's the creative impulse itself, stripped bare, reduced to its most basic elements in the face of death.
Right. It speaks to that regression to the imaginary, but also suggests a kind of primordial creativity, a return to the source of inspiration that exists beyond language, beyond symbolic structures.
This is blowing my mind. We've gone from snippets of conversation to unraveling the unconscious, the nature of dreams, the impact of death. This whole conversation makes me think about how we use language, ritual, even humor, to grapple with something as vast as death.
That's what makes this dialogue so rich. It doesn't offer easy answers, but it opens a space for exploration, for questioning, for grappling with these existential dilemmas at the core of the human experience.
Like peeking behind the curtain of our carefully constructed realities, catching a glimpse of those raw, chaotic forces that shape our lives. And maybe, in that glimpse, we find a new kind of understanding, a deeper appreciation for the complexities of our own psyches and the ways we make meaning in the face of the unknown.
You know, it's fascinating how these fragments, they bring together the sacred and the profane, the philosophical and the everyday. It's like life itself, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And there's this interesting tension, I think, between the psychoanalyst and the figure of the priest. They both deal with confession, interpretation, searching for meaning, but in very different ways.
What's striking is how the priest's traditional authority seems to be, well, diminished. He forgets the funeral rites, his pronouncements feel hollow. Could this be a reflection of, a broader cultural shift, where faith is being challenged and that psychoanalytic perspective offers a new way of understanding the human condition?
Like the psychoanalyst is stepping into that void left by the decline of traditional religious authority. He's not offering dogma, not giving easy answers, but he does provide a framework for understanding those complexities of human experience.
And yet, even with the psychoanalyst there, the dialogue doesn't completely abandon the religious framework. The repeated mentions of God, even alongside that jarring "God is of the devil" statement, it shows a persistent grappling with spiritual questions.
Yeah, it's like they're simultaneously rejecting and clinging to faith, reflecting how complex, how contradictory belief itself can be, caught between the comfort of those traditional structures and the unsettling realization that those structures might not hold all the answers.
Exactly. And that tension between the sacred and the secular, the rational and the irrational, it's so central to the human experience, especially when we're confronted with the mystery of death.
So we've explored a lot. The symbolic, the imaginary, the real, the role of the psychoanalyst, this interplay of faith and doubt. We even talked about these dialogues as a kind of dream work, a window into the collective unconscious. But before we wrap up, I want to bring it back to the listener. What do you hope someone takes away from this deep dive into these, unsettling conversations about death?
If we connect all of this back to the bigger picture, I think it comes down to this. Even facing death, that ultimate encounter with the real, we still strive to make meaning. Whether we cling to the symbolic order, regress to the imaginary, or find ourselves caught somewhere in between, the human drive to understand, to narrativize our experience is incredibly powerful.
And for anyone listening who's ever felt lost, uncertain, in the face of loss, remember this. Your own process of grappling with those big questions, it's a meaningful journey in itself. Maybe these fragmented conversations, this peek into someone else's grappling, can help you feel less alone on that journey.
Beautifully said. And perhaps in the spirit of Lacanian thought, the most potent questions are the ones that linger. The ones that prompt us to keep searching, keep dreaming, keep making meaning out of the mysteries of life and death.
This has been quite a deep dive. We've uncovered so much meaning in these seemingly simple fragments, exploring everything from the symbolic order to the nature of dreams.
It's been a pleasure unpacking these complex ideas with you, and I hope our listeners will continue pondering the questions we've raised today.
And if this deep dive has left you with more questions than answers, well, that's all right. Sometimes the most important thing is to stay curious, to keep exploring, and to remember that the search for meaning, it's a journey, not a destination.